On today's episode of the Broadway Shuffle, we've got a special guest joining us. Tim Krueger will be hopping in with me to discuss bracketology. We're going to discuss the Red Raiders, where we kind of fit into the 2 and 3 seed discussions, where there are tricky parts of the bracket, and what we should kind of be watching for as Selection Sunday comes. So tune in. It's definitely technical discussion. So yeah, it's a lot of fun. Something that I really love talking about. Tim really knows his stuff. We were talking a little bit before the interview, and he was mentioning he's done it longer than Joe Lunardi. So this guy is truly a pioneer of the bracketology community. You can follow them over at Banner Bracket Society on YouTube and Twitter. You can also check him and a gentleman named Dave Amon out at bracketville.com. They run a website. So yeah, tune in. It's a lot of fun. Looking forward to getting into this conversation. And yeah, we'll get to the interview. And now on the Broadway Shuffle, we have a special guest joining us. One of the most esteemed bracketologists in the community, Tim Krueger, joins the Broadway Shuffle. Tim, thanks for joining us tonight. Happy to have you on.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, bracketology is one of those things that I get super invested in once the calendar turns to January. You guys do it all year round. I would love for you to just briefly introduce yourself. Tell people, kind of how you got into this and a little bit of your background.
Well, I got into this a long time ago, probably 30 years plus, doing it at a very small level. I've gotten over the years, one of the really great things about this is I've gotten to know Joe Lunardi very well, and he and I were talking one time, and we kind of just throwing it back and forth that I've probably been doing it longer than he has. So,
Wow.
yeah, so I started out just doing it on a small website. Then I went to Big Play Sports, and then later I got an opportunity to do it at Stadium. So I've been there for quite a few years. And then this year I made the move over to Bracketville. Dave Amon, who's a friend of mine who I've met through the bracketology, who's part of our Banner Brackets mock selection committee, got to know him, and he had a site Bracketville, and he was kind of looking to expand it. So it was a perfect timing, perfect marriage. So this is my first year over there. So check everything out at bracketville.wordpress.com. And Dave does a fabulous job with all the information he puts out. And so now we've got a bunch of stuff planned this week, obviously, heading into the selection. Going to do some podcasts to kind of bounce things back and forth where we differ and so on and so forth. So
yeah, you're bouncing between the MIG.
You kind of already filled in the Banner Brackets part. You get to know people through the industry, and you get to see their work and respect them. So we just started doing this about 3-4 years ago. This is number 4. Last year we got together in person, which was awesome to do it. This year we did it all remotely. So as we talk about, you're going to hear me talk about some things, and it's really helpful if you want more explanation about what happened and what to do. Just go to Banner Brackets on YouTube, and all our stuff is there. The one thing I should mention right at the top while we get into this, because this will probably come up. So about 10 years ago, I had the opportunity. The NCAA did what they call mock selection groups, and they would bring in different people from around the country, bracketologists, media members, so on and so forth. This was in 2015, so I got to go to the next to last one they did, and then they quit doing them. I don't know why. It really didn't cost them a whole lot of money. But anyway, they would set up the room exactly like the committee. The committee chair was there. Another member of the committee was there. And we obviously did a condensed version over about 2 days, but used all of their tools and bells and whistles and so forth. And had Dan Gavitt in the room with us, saying, hey, that was a great discussion, or hey, we would never bring this up, or whatever. And it was awesome. So
that's very cool. I'm glad you're able to squeeze the Broadway Shuffle in before you do some Joe Lunardi hits. So thanks for squeezing the Broadway Shuffle in between your ESPN talk. Very cool that you know Joe. That's really neat. And I imagine it's got to be interesting. You go on those committees, and you probably know a lot more about bracketology than some of those athletic directors that come in. You've got a better idea of what's going on than probably the new members coming in. Is that kind of a weird dynamic? Do they reach out and ask you for input? Some of those people, you've done it for 30 plus years. Are you a resource for them, or how does that work?
No, you do run into a few of them. It was really fortunate that I cover Creighton on a regular basis. I was in last time Creighton and Texas Tech played. I was in Maui. That was just a terrific. Gosh, what a terrific game that was.
Tough game.
Went to the day before, interviewed your coach. It was great. Yeah. So it's that our athletic director at Creighton, a former athletic director, he's now retired, but he got put on the committee, and I want to say he was on there for like at least 4 years, 5 years, something like that, and eventually became the committee chair.
Nice.
So when that whole period was on, obviously, he reached out to me, and I would send him into my bracket every week, and he would sometimes not comment, sometimes say, "Hey, just wondering why you have this team here," and I'd give him the reason. He goes, "Oh, okay," or whatever, and So, and he bounced things off me, and we at that time we're now we did a show called Blue Jay Banner, which covers Creighton athletics, but at that time we were on the radio doing it. Now we're doing a podcast for him like most people, but I was on the radio and doing it, and we used to do a selection show, and he came on the year he was vice chair of the committee, and he had to follow the chairman around because the next year he was going to be the chairman, so he had to go to New York with him and do all the stuff. So that was so cool that he came on like an hour and a half after they had put the bracket out, and we got to fire questions at him. It was great.
That's really neat. We're going to talk a lot about, Texas Tech and the bracket in general. Bracketology is something that's really interesting to me. We talked kind of before this, how it's kind of like a puzzle, but you're trying to predict how somebody else does this particular puzzle. You all have the same information, but you're trying to guess what they're going to do. When you look at this bracket, generally speaking, how does this field compare to fields past? What are some unique things about this? Weaknesses, strengths? What are you kind of seeing compared to some of the other fields you've seen in the past?
Yeah, everyone's a little different. This one, the first thing that jumps out at you, and all my fellow bracketologists said the same thing. From about number 18 on the seed line down to about number 33, you've just got teams you could put them in a hat and put them in different orders, and I probably wouldn't scream too much. Usually there's a group of teams like 3 or 4, not that many. I mean, they're all sitting there. The team I follow, Creighton's in that group too, and there's other Big East teams in there. There's the Gonzaga and St. Mary's of the world who are playing now, and there's some power conference teams that have kind of slid down. There's Memphis. Like, what the hell do you do with Memphis? And so all those teams are in there, and it's people ask, well, will we slide? Will we win? I said, if you're in that group, it's just hard to move right now because there's just resumes that all look the same and very, very much alike. So that's probably the most unique thing. I would say about 2 weeks ago, the unique thing was the tremendous. It's been a long time since we had a team like Auburn just blowing through, number one in every metric there is possibly out there. And then obviously now this is really the first full year where we've had these expanded conferences. And so to see the number of SEC teams up there is crazy. Like in the old way, and we'll talk about this later, but in the old way, the way they used to do bracketing, it would be a real nightmare. They've made it a little easier, but that, and then just over the last week, the bubble was, every year people say this is the weakest bubble. Okay. And most years they say baloney. This is what bubble teams do. They lose. So let's not say that.
There's a reason they're on the bubble.
This year it is really weak. Okay. It really is. I mean, you could kick a lot of these teams out in other years. But over the last weekend, really, it all just kind of melted away. And really now you've got about legitimately, I mean, if you really want to reach, you've probably got 6 teams for 3 spots, which is not bad.
That was my thought initially too. I thought, with the way that the SEC teams kind of separated themselves, my conspiracy theory mind is like Greg Sankey's pulling all these strings. He's going to get all these teams in the tournament, but I know that's not actually what's happening. But yeah, it seems like it's really clear, and a couple bid stealers would probably make it even more clear.
Absolutely.
And we'll get into that in a sec. One thing I did want to plug, you mentioned banner brackets, and I don't know that I fully explained that to our listeners. If you enjoy bracketology and you want to understand how how this pie is kind of cooked, how we get this, how we get the bracket, go over and watch their YouTube channel at Banner Brackets. It's a lot of content. They're going to do it over 4 days, and it's 5 to 6 hours of video, but it's really informative on how the committee does their things. What are the items that they're looking for? What do they think is important? These guys have been in there. They've sat on that. They know what they're talking about. And if you enjoy bracketology, it's pretty much the best piece of content out there. So if you haven't already, go over there, subscribe to their channel, watch that stuff. It's really interesting if you're into that. Anyway, let's get
I would say for Texas Tech fans, that Thursday session, the first thing you'll get is how we place teams in the field, and then we do that for a little bit, and then we go into the seeding. And Texas Tech comes up pretty early, and we get in pretty deep discussions about them. So.
And even on Sunday, the Sunday episode where you go back and scrub, the argument between, Tech, St. John's, Kentucky, what stood out to me, it's kind of like Tech is the best of both worlds between St. John's and Kentucky, but almost in a bad way. Like if you value elite wins, you're probably going to go with Kentucky. If you want a cleaner resume, you're going to go with St. John's. I think the argument for Tech to be on the 2 line is not as strong in my mind. I think they have a case, but I don't know. I think if it depends on which way you go, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Tech's resume, where do you see him ending up if the field was, selected today?
So I put out a bracket this morning over at Bracketville, and I had them the last 2. They by no means was it easy. I think the first 7 are pretty easy.
Sure.
Then you get to that one, and that one's a tough one. Our committee, most of the members of our committee like Kentucky more than me, and one other member I know.
And it's fair. I think the arguments are really reasonable. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't argue in it. And my partner over there, Brackville, Dave Ullman, who was on the selection committee as well, he said today, he goes, look, it's just going to depend on what the committee likes. Do they like you said, do they like the clean bracket, the huge number of wins St. John's had? Do they like the high-powered wins Kentucky had? Or do they focus on the tremendous road wins? And then you would go Texas Tech way, right? So,
sure.
Because hardly anybody's won at BYU. Hardly anybody ever wins at Kansas. Hardly everybody ever wins at Houston. Those are awesome wins. So, but with Tech, when you get beyond that a little bit, then you're like, ooh. They really don't have a lot on the plate other than Baylor, West Virginia,
and then even if you're diving into that,
Arizona, but
it's Baylor without VJ Edgecombe. It's the 2 Arizona State games are without Jaden Quaintance. There's things that I obviously follow Tech super closely, so I understand all those things. And I know a lot of wins have asterisks, even the losses.
Sure.
You lost to A&M without Toppin. You've had different things. It's just so interesting. What pieces will be brought up. That may be brought up. It may not be brought up at all. And how much does that sway a committee member? Do you think Tech's kind of locked into the 3 line right now, even if they UK wins the tournament?
I would think so. I would think so. I would think it would be really hard for them to drop. The only thing you would kind of look there is you do have another member in there with Iowa State in that 3 area. So, they may, something happens. Iowa State wins the postseason and they jump them ahead.
Sure.
We'll get to what the committee does with these tournaments, but to your point about Tech, it just depends on it's just really, it's hard for us. And people say, well, oftentimes I get the question, do you do the bracket like you think it should be or the committee? And I say both are kind of the same, through the years. Certainly I may have a whacked idea on certain teams. And then, I look at bracket matrix and then do with the mock and I'm like, man, I was too high on that team or too low, whatever the case is. But for the most part, I mean, I kind of know what the committees, the one thing I always wish through the 30 years I've been doing this is that the committee would be more consistent from year to year. So in other words, hey, if you're I always think this way. If you're like on the bubble, okay, and it's 2 teams, and let's just say for the fun of it, well, let's just take the SEC last week, Oklahoma and Texas, okay? Let's say that game was played in the SEC tournament first round. I just think that game should weigh just a little more because isn't it just like an NCAA tournament game? Winner in, loser out. I mean, it is. But they don't. They take one, and I understand why. That's the one thing. But the other thing is I just wish there were just a hair more like And it seems like they go inconsistently up and down the bracket. And I guess if you looked at my bracket, maybe you could pick that apart too. But
Sure.
like sometimes they'll say, well, this team had great road wins. That's why we put it over there. This team had great road wins. Then they go down to here and like, wait, that team had great road wins and you didn't put them over that team,
Exactly. Yeah. It
But
doesn't seem.
some
Yeah.
things could be overwhelming. And again, it comes down to 12 people. So 12 people are voting and they could all have different thoughts. So that's where this all gets a little bit goofy.
And just from a philosophical standpoint, I can understand the argument for like a strictly formulaic approach, but I think the committee adds a lot of intrigue, and it would be kind of boring if it was formulaic. If you knew exactly where you were at the end of the season and who's in, who's out, that's not nearly as fun.
Yeah, probably. I think so. And I think we're kind of seeing that with football, right? Like this first time with the expanded, and everybody's like, whoa, 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 whoa. No, that's what makes it great. That's what makes it fun,
think it's great too. I like the human element. I like that there can be mistakes, and I like that in sports. I don't like that necessarily in other areas, but I like some nuance and some contextual things, not just KPI, WAB, SOR. Your average there is how you get seeded. That I know those things are helpful and they should be used, but don't just use that to seed and select teams. I like that there's nuance and context, even if it's inappropriately applied sometimes.
Yeah, and to your point, but I will say this about the community. There's one axiom that's held true, and they bring it up almost every year. It's, when they went way back and did this, it was who'd you play, where'd you play them, and how'd you do? So that encompasses pretty much everything, right? Who did you play, strength of schedule, where'd you play them, home, road, neutral, did you win? Did you win by 100? Did you win by 2?
Sure.
That's all baked into those predictive metrics. And just to let everybody know, I'm old fashioned. I'm not all whippy on all these new stats. I kind of feel there's getting to be so many now, it kind of just muddies the water.
Sure.
And one of our members this week, Rocco Miller, had a great, who I always thought was kind of leaned a little more toward the metrics than the actual what's on the paper, right? But this year, I noticed there was a little bit of maybe I just didn't pick up on it, but he had a great comment. He goes, everything you need to know, you don't need to go look at Torvig or Ken Palm. Everything you need to know is right on that team sheet.
Sure.
All you use those metrics for is to check your work, so to speak, and make sure you're on the right path. And I thought that was well put by him. And
I think he's right, and I'm not going to disagree or argue with that. I guess maybe the only slight caveat I would have had is, name brand. So winning at Kansas, for example, that win probably means more than it actually does from a quantitative standpoint. Because Kansas is a top 30 team, not the typical top 8 team, but it probably in the committee's eyes gets valued a lot more than, let's say, who's another top 20, like winning at Clemson or something like that. Which one would weigh more in the committee's mind? Winning at Kansas. And that's where, I think that does benefit Tech. But that's where I do like those metrics and I think it helps a lot of teams like UC San Diego or something like that. Like, how do you appropriately value beating Cal State Northridge or beating UC Irvine? Most members aren't going to have any idea who those schools are, where they are. But if you can see a WAB number or something like that, that's where I think those are really helpful. But I think I do agree. They're tools. They're not necessarily the end all be all. But we could get off, way on a tangent. You guys know way more about that stuff. I wanted to kind of bring you back to something that a lot of people may not understand, and it's going to be relevant to Tech. Talk about the top 4 protected seeds and the number of SEC teams that are going to be there, and why that will kind of affect us and where we're going.
Yeah, so the top 4 protected seeds are the top 16, basically. Just like you saw in the NCAA reveal, that's the protected seeds. They get first dibs on where, they kind of set the field as far as the 8 sites for the first weekend of the tournament, okay? So let's just run through this real quick. So like Auburn is number 1. They're going to go to Lexington. That's where they want to go. And the number 1 seed gets a phone call from the committee and said, hey, where do you want to go?
That's awesome.
Yeah. I know there was one year with Kansas. They could have gone to I want to say it was closer to go to Indy or something. I forget where it was, than to go to Houston. Well, Bill Self said, no, I want to go to Houston because we have an extra day off from the Big 12 tournament. Then we play Friday, Sunday. So that was very interesting. Yeah. But that's how that goes. So Auburn would go to Lexington. Number 2, Duke. Obviously, they're going to go to Raleigh. Number 3 is Houston. Their closest and by a long shot, is Wichita. If you look on a map, it's straight up from.
Yep.
And then number 4 is Florida, and they would also go to Raleigh. That would be their closest site. So when we got to the 2 line, and let's say Tech just ended up number 8, okay?
Yep.
Then we would go, Tennessee would go to Cleveland. Alabama would go to Lexington.
And because they're good to those areas.
I had that backwards. Alabama goes to Lexington. Tennessee goes to Cleveland because that's the next closest site. Michigan State would obviously go to Cleveland. And then comes Texas Tech. Well, the closest site for Texas Tech by a not a whole lot, but a little bit is Wichita. So that's where they would go. Now, what interesting comes into play, a lot of brackets, including mine, have A&M right on their heels.
Sure.
If that were to flip around, then A&M would get Wichita, Tech would get Denver, because there's nowhere remotely close for them to go other than Denver.
Sure.
Which, I don't know how Tech fans feel. I think that would be probably pretty good
better,
because it's easy flight into Denver. You know, there's
it's one of the few areas that's got direct flights.
Yeah,
out of Lubbock.
Absolutely. I don't know how far. Let's see. I should know that because one year Creighton played San Antonio, we drove. Me and 3 other guys drove.
That's not a fun drive.
I remember getting to Wichita, and I'm thinking, well, we're not bad. And then we got to Oklahoma City. I thought we're done. Oh, we're in Texas already. Yeah, well, no, you're driving for another 10 hours in Texas. Okay?
Yeah, you're exactly right. Yeah, Houston for us is like a 10-hour drive,
which
is crazy. Yeah. Same state, and it's
I would think
even further.
Wichita wouldn't be bad, but there's probably roads you got to go all over the place to get to.
Yeah. But I mean, I think that's interesting, just where and how that is all kind of come together.
That's how that works.
Be fascinating.
They won't move like this comes into play once in a while. And you asked if I talked, like, there is one person I always, once a year, I text him questions. That's Dave Warlock. He's part of the NCAA, works for the NCAA. He's in the room every year. Bracketing is really his baby. So I always have bracketing questions like, hey, if it's 25 miles further for this team to go here, and then the next one would be so much closer to go to this side, would you switch them? He goes, no, we don't do that. You switch around.
That's
wild.
I
would think seems odd to me, right? Like,
yeah, exactly.
Your whole goal is to go to this pod system was so teams didn't have to travel so far. Why wouldn't you? But they're trying to be consistent and make it fair for everyone. So.
It is funny though, like, because the West region, if Florida was last 1 seed, they'll play their regional in Seattle, or where do they play? They play in Seattle for the regional.
San Francisco. The West regional in San Francisco.
Yeah, it's funny. You get the 1 seed, you think you get all this preference, but it's like, no, you got to be the absolute top 1 seed if you want absolute geographic presence.
Florida would go to West right now.
Yeah. They would
go there. However, Rocco on our committee knows Todd, knows the head coach at Florida very well. He's from San Francisco, so he wants to go to San Francisco. So he's okay.
Awesome. Would be very, very interesting. Getting back to the bracket writ large, which seed lines are you kind of having a hard time with right now, where you're looking at, and I know you mentioned this earlier, we could probably just get into the which specific line, but you said 18 through 33. If you had to condense that to 4 specific spots on the seed line, where are you having the most trouble right now, or I guess feel the least confident?
Yeah, I mean, obviously down in the 3, that Texas A&M, Texas Tech area and Kentucky area is tough right at the top. But then, I don't think that there's any big problem. I think the first time you run into something is when you get to Clemson. What do you do with Clemson? They're 26-5 for crying out loud. I keep trying to come back to winning's important, right? You tipped the ball 31 times, you won 26. You beat the number 1 team in, Duke, number 1 net team right now. You beat Kentucky, speaking of Kentucky. So those are big wins. But other than that, they don't have much on the resume, and they haven't really done anything away from home. So, if you remember our group when we went through it, they kind of docked Clemson for that. I kind of thought like, well, they got 26 wins. Then I went back and looked at it last night when I'm doing my bracket, and I said, I think they are kind of right. I squeezed Clemson, I think, into number 17, just 1 out of the top 4 seeds. So that's probably the first tough one. And then I think people in general, there's a difference in Oregon, because I think people have in mind, they had that 4-game losing streak, but I saw them in Vegas. Creighton was in the Vegas tournament, so over Thanksgiving, and it was a terrific event. We had Houston, A&M, Alabama, Oregon, Creighton. It was unbelievable. San Diego State. I mean,
Sure.
and that Oregon Alabama game was one of the best games I saw all year for the championship. And Oregon just was playing lights out, and then they stumbled. But now they've kind of got their footing. Well, this is important for the average fan too to remember that game in November 17th is just as important as that game tomorrow.
Yep.
They're just one data point on a big
Mhm.
map. So you can't ignore what happened back then. They're a little bit of a problem, but then you get to the two teams playing for the WCC title, St. Mary's and Gonzaga, and they're the ones that everybody because Gonzaga is number 8 in the net. People say, how can that possibly be? They haven't really played much on their schedule. They're 3-6 against teams in the tournament, and the 3 teams they beat are bubble teams.
Yeah.
So they're really 0-6 against the teams that are solidly in. So the reason why, and people often ask this, main reason why is if you play a really good schedule, your net's going to go up a little bit. B, it has to do with playing teams, say quad 4 teams, and beating the brakes off them.
Yeah.
And frankly, Tech's the same way. I mean, you look at Tech had 36-point wins, 40-point wins, and so forth. When you look at their overall, I mean, they're 294 non-conference, so they didn't play a particularly tough non-conference, but they beat them. There's different avenues here, and it's one that's been talked about a lot, but they just don't seem to want to change it, and that is they do have like a 10-point, supposedly, because we don't know all the things that go into it.
Yeah,
they have
about
a 10-point cutoff. If it's over 10, they don't do it. However, there are offensive efficiencies and defensive efficiencies. They don't have a cap on those. They're not adjusted. So that's how it happens.
And really, from a predictive side, nor should you, because I guess, and this is not an argument in Tech's favor. It's just, beating a team by 30 is more impressive than beating a team by 20 or 10 or other. But how, contextually, if you're beating the brakes off of Arkansas Pine Bluff, how much should that actually improve your metric rating? Maybe not that team in specific.
Here's why I would argue with you on that. Okay. I'll give you a perfect example. Creighton played San Diego State in Vegas. Their point guard was out, so forget it. And Pop Isaacs, who well,
very familiar,
that's when his hip was really starting to bother him again. And eventually, obviously, after he poured like 30 in against Kansas, he had to go have surgery out for the year. But he was still playing a little bit there. But their other point guard, Stephen Ashworth, who's been terrific all year, was out for that game. Okay. So when it got to be a blowout, Coach Mack knows he's got, 2 more games coming up here in the next 3 days. Hey, let's yank the starters out. So then the score,
sure. Yeah,
I don't know how much it did, but I'm just using this kind of an example. So really what could be a 10-point game could be a 20-point game. And that's right. When you see somebody win by 30, you don't know, maybe they've just played their starters the whole time. And maybe you're comparing, Iowa State played that team. They only won by 10. Well, they had their whole second and third squad in there in the whole second half of the second. You don't know unless you really drill down. And then that's a little bit too much, right? I mean, you can't just so you just got to go with what's there,
and you hope that there's enough data points that it all kind of washes out. Like you said, with resumes, each individual game is just a single point on your efficiency metric, and ideally, they're fading. Like a game in November should not count as much toward your efficiency metrics as, let's say, a game on February 28th. It should have some predictive value, but decreasing. I know KenPom's talked about this. Like, preseason ratings have some impact, but they almost entirely get degraded out as you get more performance metrics. And I don't remember if he's talked specifically about his methodology, but more recent games should have impact. But it's neither here nor there. It's not a perfect system, but
no, it's not.
Ultimately, it is what it is. There's not a ton that
if you follow point spreads at all and you go to KenPom nails them almost every day.
He does. He's got a great.
There's something to that, but I know Ken. I've talked to Ken before, and he said, a lot of people like to just recite his thing like the Bible, and he's pretty much like, it's not that, man. I have outliers too, and I know at one time when they went to readjust, and that's when these added metrics got put on the NCAA team sheets. They had a big meeting one summer. Ken just basically said, if you're going to use mine to pick the teams, you're going down the wrong path. And I think Jeff Sagarin at the time said, if you use my ratings and we had a team that played the top 30 teams in the country, lost by 1 point to all of them, so they're 0 for 30, they would be number one in my ranking.
Yeah.
And you're not going to put an 0
But
30 team number one. So,
sure.
you got to take everything with a grain of salt. And I do think the committee, that's why they have that team sheet in front of them.
Yep.
If you're wondering about a team sheet, Warren Nolan's a great site to go to. That
Absolutely.
team sheet, I said I was in the committee room. That team sheet's as close as I've seen to what they actually showed us in the committee room.
And, and I guess the nice thing about the predictors, though, if you think about cases like, even Wichita State or Loyola Chicago, getting, I don't know that predictors being on the team sheet would have helped them a ton, but, probably if that bracket gets set today using these metrics, there's no way that those teams are going there. And so, I guess that's where it could be helpful, because those teams were probably really underseeded compared to what they should have been based on how they were performing, especially that Wichita State team.
Yeah.
And they had 30-something wins.
It varies, though. You look at Drake, obviously they're the AQ now, and thank God they are, because I didn't want them to have to wait. They've had a great season, but, they're and then there's a lot of controversy over BPI that it's.
Well, that one is flawed inherently.
It's an ESPN metric. I'm not saying it does. It just seems to benefit the teams that they cover a lot.
Totally. I think it's almost proven out.
It seems to shaft, say, the Big East, and teams
Big
they
Ten.
don't cover. Yeah. So,
well, and then the preseason ratings, I thought I saw that where their preseason ratings are just not adjusting out. So if you were thought to be a good team early on, it hasn't fully phased out.
Right. And you notice last year the Mountain West had a great season, and they got really shafted on the seeding. And what they found out was that there was an altitude thing in there.
Yeah.
So they basically supposedly took that out of BPI. But anyway, back to Drake. So they're sitting 57 KenPom, 58 Torvik. So the predictives aren't really shining on them either. So that was always my worry when people said, "Oh, they're in." I'm like,
yeah,
depends on what they want.
Well, we could go off on a ton of things there. There's a couple other questions I wanted to get to, and I definitely don't want to keep you all night. I'd love to, make sure that we're timely here.
We can go till midnight. That's fine.
Oh man, I don't know if I can go to midnight. The wife's gonna yank me out of here. Something that I really want to jump into, and that jumps out to me personally as a fan and as somebody that doesn't do this full time, that 7 to 8 seed line looks incredibly strong, and I can't decide if I'm prisoner of the moment. And you see the name UConn, you see the name Gonzaga, you see the name Illinois, but that line looks incredibly strong to me from, I guess, a predictive standpoint. What are your thoughts on that line generally? Is that one of the stronger ones you've seen? Am I completely off base? Talk a little bit about that seed line.
A seed line is name brand. And I want to get back, because this kind of ties into something you said earlier about, to the committee, that win over Kansas will look better.
Sure.
And we brought that up in Banner Rackets this weekend, and I kind of disagree with my group. I don't think when you're in that room and you start comparing teams and looking at resumes, I think you kind of forget it's Kansas or Duke or whatever. Now, look, the committee in years past has always seemed to have man, if Duke is close, they're getting a 1 seed. It kind of seems that way.
Sure.
But so I don't know about, you can say it's strong, but maybe are we just looking at the
UConn
names on the front of the jerseys? I don't know. But you're right. You've got Gonzaga. You've got a BYU team on my bracket today. You got a BYU team that's in there too. UCLA is in there. The problem, like we said this weekend, 7 and 8 seeds in this bracket. You have 5 teams for 7, and you have 5 for 8. You gotta move somebody, and somebody's gonna look awkward. And I know I pushed Gonzaga up a notch today, just with that kind of mindset, because what I did was I do these little things to kind of differentiate teams. So I compared St. Mary's, Clemson, and Gonzaga, who all have a lot of wins, who all have kind of thin resumes. And when I got all done, I said, at one point I had Clemson the last 4 and Gonzaga the first 8. And I went, when you look at them, they're a lot closer together than that. They really are. So that's when I kind of bunched them together. And so Gonzaga is the one I think everybody's trying to, what's the committee going to do with number 8 overall net? Even though they say they don't go by net, it's just a sorting tool. That's baloney. I've seen it happen too many times. It carries some weight, not a lot, but it carries some weight.
Mhm.
So the interesting thing is, what are they going to do with Gonzaga? If they start, are these new members suddenly going to get their groove when looking at resume after resume, and then they get to Gonzaga and they go, "Oh, well, there's
Yeah, what in the
nothing
world
on
is
here. No,
this?
let's put them down to 8." Who
Yeah.
knows, right? Um, but you're right. There are a lot of strong teams in there. We kind of projected ahead a little bit and said, well, what about the tournament? The ones are so strong this year that maybe the 8s won't win that game. But then we looked at the 7s and, whoever you have in there, Texas Tech, Kentucky, A&M or whatever, you've got some real strong teams that could give them a battle. Especially Michigan State. I
Totally.
mean, they could be battle. Tennessee
Mm-hmm.
seems to throw up clunkers once in a while, right? And
Yep.
I've loved Alabama all year, and I kind of feel I was really happy to see them beat Auburn. I really feel like
I was too.
they're gonna. I love Mark Sears. He's such a great kid. I met him in Vegas, and he's so great. So I really root for them and hope they do really well in the tournament. But yeah, and then you go. To your point though, then you go to the 6 line. Okay, so let's say you're gonna try and move somebody up. You've got some teams that are kind of like slumping now, like Marquette, Michigan. So how will the committee look at their overall resumes and how far down will they drag them? And then I know there's a team you want to talk about, Memphis.
Yeah, it's the firebrand. You bring up Memphis and everybody gets really mad at you saying, what are these wins where where do you put Memphis? I mean, they've got that excellent non-conference, all those non-conference wins. One of the best resumes on that side, going into January that anybody had, and yet they're playing so poorly. What do you do with a team like that?
So this year, I created, moving to Bracketville, I thought I better bring some value, right?
Sure.
So I created this new resume metric. So it'd be kind of like KPI or something. And
Yeah.
basically what it was, if you were a Ken Palm mathematician, you would throw up if you saw my method, but because it was fairly simple, I can basically, when I do it once a week, I can basically do it in my head, with
Sure.
the sheet up there. It goes very fast. Basically, it just measured how you did against the schedule you played. So if you had a Q1A road win, that was worth the most points. And then it
Sure.
would just scale down to Q2B. And you got points if you went on the road in Q3 and won, but then you lost some points if you had bad losses along the way.
Sure.
Memphis was at, I think, number 3 on our BV rankings. Obviously, Auburn was first,
Yeah.
but Alabama was up there. But Memphis was in there, gosh, I want to say the first 2 months at least.
Mhm.
3 months probably deep into January. Because their non-conference, you look at their resume, it blows you away. The teams they beat, the teams they played. I mean, they scheduled, they went out and played people.
And
Now
if
I
they
know
wouldn't have done that, they'd be in huge trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. And there were committees in the past that said, well, I remember them. It's been a few years, but we've had some that have been, hey, they went out and tried to play people,
Mhm.
and they gave somebody a nudge for that. But Memphis, yeah, I mean, they haven't. Somebody pointed out this weekend too. They haven't really. Every time they've lost a game, they've come back real strong too. They haven't had a long losing streak. I mean,
Which is different from Memphis's of years past.
And every time I open up their resume, I'm just like, what? They won 26 games? Because it doesn't seem like it. It seems like you're always talking negatively about them.
Yeah. Well,
So,
and that's on the predictive side because they keep
right.
beating, you beat Wichita State by 8. You beat Tulane
blow
by
anybody
12. You beat Tulsa by 12. It's just like, golly, we want you to beat. But yeah, they got 6 Q1 wins in the non-con. And then they added what? 1, 2 Q2. I mean, that's crazy. You had 6 Q1 wins and 2 Q2 wins.
They're 11
before...
and 2. Probably have the best percentage of anybody in Q1 and 2. I mean, 11 and 2.
Yeah, and they're projecting as like an 8 seed, 7 seed, somewhere in there.
I've got them as 6 now.
Okay.
And I wouldn't be shut. I don't think they're gonna go up to a 5, just because number 48 in the net. That's
you got to scroll down to
all
find
based
them.
on the predictives. So I don't know about that, but I wouldn't be upset if I miss on Memphis, I miss on Memphis. I mean, I think I've got them in an area where they're going to land somewhere in there. But yeah, it is a shame that, and again, that's where I'm kind of down on my
Sure.
predictives, because there's a perfect example of a team that shouldn't be getting hammered that much. They're playing in a conference. There are some good teams. People don't think there are. There are some good teams in that league.
Yeah, UNT, FAU. I mean, decent UAB.
North Texas.
Yep.
So there's some good teams in that league, and I don't care what league. Obviously it's kind of easy for me to relate because Creighton used to be a mid-major, and when I was covering them, they had great teams. But then people would hammer us for losing at Indiana State. I'm like, well,
yeah,
it's not an easy road trip to go down to the Evansville, Indiana, in the middle of the winter, and it's you're gonna lose one. You're gonna come up empty one time on the road. So I understand what's happening to Memphis, but
yeah,
does the committee, and that's where look strictly at metrics and maybe not look. The good thing is there are representatives in that committee. Each committee member has a conference or two.
Sure.
So they are really in depth, and then they have these regional reports they all get on I think once a month too. So they do get a sense of maybe the team. So I think
and that's where, when we talked about earlier, the name brand value, nobody respects a loss at Indiana State or necessarily respects a win at Indiana State. And that's where I think those resume metrics and predictive metrics help a lot. How good is this team actually? There's been plenty of years, Indiana State last year, that'd be better than beating like half the ACC teams on the road. But, nobody's going to think that because they don't know anything about the Sycamores.
Yeah.
And that's where I do like that. I think it helps out the little guys and in some senses. But yeah, I don't want to keep you here all night. There's kind of three questions I kind of wanted to finish up with. Where do you kind of see the bubble right now? And I guess really where I see it, and I'll ask you this, would you rather be Xavier or would you rather be Ohio State if the tournament was selected today?
Ooh, what a great question. So interesting you asked. I am a firm believer in you can't have 16 losses. There's only 3 teams ever to get in with 15.
Yep.
They're sitting there at 17 and 14. So I'm just almost like discounting them. And then I went back and looked at with a little help from my buddy Kerry, went back and looked at those 3 teams that did make it. All 3 at the end of the regular season before the conference tournament were 17 and 14. They each won 2 games in their conference tournament. Each one beat a team that was going to the tournament. So Ohio
You guys
State.
are doing your research, man. That is.
Yeah, I just want to make sure, because I'd almost like totally X them out, and then I'm like, I better just make sure here.
Sure.
So tomorrow they play. We're taping this on Tuesday night, I should say. So tomorrow they're playing Iowa in the first round of the Big Ten tournament. Iowa just coming off a big win over Nebraska to get in the tournament. They would have been not in the tournament. They won the game. They're kind of dangerous because if they're hitting shots, they can put runs on you, man. So Ohio State has to win that game. Then they play Illinois. So with the path I just followed with those other 3, that would be the perfect path, right? Illinois is in. If they beat Illinois, then they could end up 19 and 15. And I think you would have a very good argument because their resume is very similar to that Florida team in 2019 that made it in at 19 and 15. They have 3 wins against the field, but they've beaten some decent teams. And so they're, Now, Xavier, a team that I see quite a bit, obviously, in the Big East, but this shocks people because of St. John's. I'm telling you right now, Xavier's the best team in that conference over the last 2-3 weeks. They are rolling. The negative on Xavier is when they started the Big East, they had to go through UConn, St. John's, Marquette, boom, right off the bat.
And no Fremantle, right?
They were Fremantle, I think, missed one of those games. He missed 3 total this year. And they had lost a player right at the start of the season who they thought was really going to contribute. So they kind of were still adjusting to all that, right? And so they were still trying to get their legs underneath them, kind of like Creighton had to do without Pop Isaacs. When he went down, they had to kind of figure things out for a while. So people always say, well, you lost to Georgetown by 21. Well, that was a week after that happened, man. We're trying to figure it out. So But since then, they're just, they blew the brakes off Creighton. They went to Marquette and won. I mean, yeah. But so they got 5th place. They play in the opening round of the Big East tournament. They play Marquette, who is slumping a little bit. The only thing holding Xavier back right now is their resume. They look a lot like North Carolina's resume. They only have 1 win in Q1. Marquette will be a Q1 win, so that'll be 2. Now you take the number of wins they're going to have plus the win over, they're number 44 in the net, so they're okay there. Their predictives are pretty good, but that would make them 22-10. I mean, that's playing 5th in the league, and with those wins, they have other good wins. They beat UConn, they beat Creighton, they beat Villanova, so they're right there. So I think just knowing the way Xavier's playing right now, I would say I would rather be them.
Okay, it'll be. I mean, because there's a good chance it all gets decided.
If the tournament, if today was Selection Sunday, and we haven't played those games yet, Xavier would be in and Ohio State would be out. So I guess I'd rather be Xavier. Plus, Madison Square Garden. Most people don't know this, but like everybody thinks, oh well, that's St. John's home court. Trust me, when UConn's in it, it's 90% UConn fans in that arena. Like last year, they played St. John's. It had to be 70-30 UConn fans. So luckily for Marquette, they're playing a game that, or Xavier, they're playing Marquette, so that's not going to be a big factor. But, that's a great question, though. Great question.
It's tough, man. Life on the bubble is not fun. We've been there several times, and it feels like every night you're sweating out games on these teams that you don't really care about. You're just trying to improve your position. Not a ton of fun. Kind of one of the last things I wanted to wrap up with, hardest team for you to see this year. Where's the team where you're like, and I think it's probably Gonzaga, Memphis, Oregon. We've kind of already touched on them already.
Yeah.
But who's the team that if they're 2 seed lines higher or lower than where you have them, you won't be shocked?
Well, I have Memphis as 6 now, so I would be shocked if they went to 4. So I'll throw them out.
But maybe not shocked if they went to 8.
Probably Xavier, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm trying to think if there's anybody down further, but those teams all kind of have reasons why we keep them down. That, like I said to people, I think San Diego State and Utah State have been in the same position on my seed line for like a month and a half. I think they don't ever go up, they don't ever go down. One quick thing I do want to add, though, that I think is really important for Texas Tech fans. You may have heard us if you go back and either saw it live or watch Banner Brackets replays. We talked a lot about the reveal, and I know some people say, well, why are you worried about the reveal? The NCAA put out about a month when the reveal was, they put out a story on the statistic. If I could say that, I'd be okay. The stats about reveal teams and in the reveal, how they did, what percent, And you would think, most people say, oh, the committee, they totally forgot what they did in the reveal. That was 3-4 weeks ago. And you listen, like when Bruce was the committee chair, he said that, oh yeah, we just ripped up, tore up, start all over. I'm telling you, those thoughts are still in their minds of where they put those teams. Maybe they don't even remember where they put them in the reveal, but the general feeling they have about that team's the same. And, Tech was the first 4.
Yeah. 13 overall.
Yeah. So, you can feel pretty safe you're going to be in a 3 because that's before you had those impressive road wins. The Purdue one, people were wondering, they were in the top 2 lines on the reveal. Only one team has not made the top 16 after being in the top 2 lines of the reveal. Now, you can say what you want, but that's
something.
Those are just stats. Every year is different, but that's kind of revealing to me.
And it's to your point, every game's weighted the same. And at that point, 75% of the season is over. So there's really only 25% of your resume left to be filled in. That even though you can move, I think people get lost in this. You can move up the seed line a ton in early January because teams have only played half their games. There's not as much filled in. When you get later in the season, it's much harder to advance because it's 1/30th of your resume as opposed to being 1/15th, which is a lot more.
Yeah.
But yeah, I know we could talk about this all night, Tim. I really do appreciate you coming on with us tonight. This has been excellent. I could talk bracketology, probably as long as I could listen to y'all's Banner Bracket Society all night. It's a ton of fun listening to that stuff. My poor wife has to endure me, talking about Q1A wins and things of that nature. And so I appreciate
My wife
her
luckily
obliging
doesn't
me.
know about any of that stuff. She gets to a point every year. That point happened about a week ago where she's like, I am so sick of basketball.
Yeah, my wife, and you don't care, but she actually played Division I basketball at
Oh,
Abilene
there we
Christian
go.
for a while, so she appreciates basketball. She can talk to me about a ghost screen, and she was a much better ball player than I was. So it's a lot of fun with that stuff. But Tim,
Once I get my wife to fill out a bracket, then she's fine. Then it's like,
oh man, she
who's
doesn't
playing?
even fill out the bracket.
No,
Doesn't even
she
do the
does.
bracket.
I'm saying
Okay,
once she fills it out, then she's like, oh, who's playing?
Then she's in. Okay.
Then
Very,
she's
very
into
good.
it.
Well, thank you. And once again, for those of you who don't follow Tim and Dave over at Bracketville, go ahead and look them up. They do an excellent job. I'm subscribed to their email list. It's awesome. You're going to get 2 or 3 things a day at this point. So really neat and helps you understand what's going on in the field. And then also Banner Brackets. They do an excellent job on that mock selection committee. Go ahead and watch some of those if you're interested in kind of how this cake gets baked. So
yeah,
Tim,
I would highly recommend it to people that, like you mentioned earlier when we were chatting, people that want to see how the committee selects the teams. Go through that process, because it's, when you go through it, you'll be like, oh wow, it's not just
very
like
different
darts here.
It's very different. The way that everybody moves in, and we could have talked about that, but I knew it would have taken 20 minutes to explain. But
no, that would have taken hours. Yeah.
Very interesting stuff. But Tim, thank you a ton. I appreciate you being on, and look forward to for Selection Sunday and seeing who's vindicated and who's got the best payment score over at Bracket Matrix. So we'll talk again soon. And thanks again.
Hey, thank you.